Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to have a look at Chapter 34, Part 2. That is the challenges to the liberal order, specifically in the form of communism, fascism, and social democracy on the world stage between the 1920s and the 1940s. So it's a lot to talk about. Let's go ahead and get into it. By the end of this presentation, you'll be able to answer these two essential questions. How did demonstrations of political legitimacy and state power during this time represent both changes and continuities from earlier eras? And two, how did the Great Depression, that worldwide economic downturn we talked about, influence the economic and political actions of states in Europe and the Americas? So with that said, let's first talk a little bit about what we mean by the liberal order. So since the word liberal has changed quite a bit in the last 100 years, when I say the liberal order, what I'm referring to is a world system or a perception of a social order which involves democracy, even a limited democracy, free trade and free markets, although we do know historically that free trade was not always practiced even by those who advocated it, as well as the idea of a balance of power. And there's a handful of nations, one or two nations that keep everyone in check, but these nations are not so powerful that they can't overwhelm one another. This can help be reinforced by a colonial empire. And essentially what I'm sort of describing is the world before World War I. Now, of course, again, as I talked about in Chapter 33, this is not always the case. Many European states did practice some sort of protectionism and limited their free markets and free trades during that time. And the balance of power clearly didn't keep the peace from beginning World War I. If anything, it made it worse. And hence why World War I and the Great Depression that followed it largely discredited this concept of a liberal order and presented a number of challenges to it. And in this presentation, we're going to look at specifically the European and American challenges to that idea. So let us start with perhaps the most prominent challenge to that entire worldview, which would be the Soviet Union. You might remember that Lenin withdrew the Soviet Union from World War I. He had promised to do so, and his predecessors in the provisional government had not done so. Despite withdrawing from the war, they still had to fight a civil war against a collection, an alliance of various anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist forces that were all known as the White Armies. This included monarchists who wanted to see the Tsar restored. It included nationalists who wanted their countries to become independent, and peasants who simply didn't like the idea of having to give up their grain to anybody. The Tambov Rebellion is one great example of this, where peasants did not want to give up their grain to Red Army units and were promptly attacked with poison gas and killed. So that clues you in, it was a pretty brutal civil war. More than just domestic anti-communist forces, the United States, as well as many of the Allied powers from World War I, including Japan, France, and Great Britain, intervened in the struggle, not explicitly to defeat the Reds. However, there was an element, especially from British leadership, that did want to destroy this potential new threat in the form of communism. I believe it was Winston Churchill who said he wanted to strangle Bolshevism in its cradle. Nonetheless, despite this intervention, the Allies were not able to stop the Reds from winning the Civil War. And in 1921, a group of Soviet leaders came together in Moscow and signed the Treaty on the Creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, known as the USSR from here on out. Lenin would be the titular head of the USSR. However, he would not have the opportunity to make a great impact on his state. He died shortly afterwards and was succeeded by a man named Joseph Stalin. Now, some of you know that Joseph Stalin is not this individual's real name, and his real name is Georgian and incredibly difficult for me to pronounce, but his first name is Joseph still. Stalin just means man of steel, and this was a name he took for himself. Upon assuming leadership of the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Party, which was now simply going by the Communist Party, sought to build a stronger state. Now, during the Civil War, the Bolsheviks had confiscated everything in the name of defeating the whites and preventing the Allied intervention from defeating their new state. However, it was quickly realized that 100% total control over everything was not necessarily a good way to go. Plus, in the interest of building an existing socialist state in Russia, they decided to allow for a little bit of privatization in something called the New Economic Policy. This allowed peasants to own a small amount of private land and to sell a little bit of food on the open market, and that allowed them to make a bit of a profit. This is going to become important in a minute, so just keep the new economic policy in mind. However, it was on the industrial front that the Soviet Union is probably perhaps best known for. And one of the key examples you need to know for this course is the 5-year plan, which if you look at the dates there, only lasted 4 years, in part because it was retroactively announced once it was already underway. And because it didn't have a set starting point and a set ending point, the government simply declared it complete in 1932. The motto being 5 in 4, as in get the 5-year plan done in 4 years. And this was state-directed industrialization, as in the state set quotas, targets, and built industry where it felt it was needed. A great example of this is the Ural Mountain city of Magnitogorsk, which began as a number of large steel factories in the Ural Mountains, designed to be built where it could not easily be attacked by a foreign power. And all of this kind of brings to mind, especially in the context of Russian history, Peter the Great of Russia, who invited foreign workers and directed early westernization and some proto-industrialization. One of the ways that the state got workers on board with all of this crash industrialization was via the widespread use of propaganda, as well as through models. And there were groups of workers called Stakhanovites who were put on display as ideal workers. They had overfulfilled their quotas. They had worked 30-plus-hour shifts. Whatever it was, they were like the hero workers. So these Stakhanovites would go and tour factories, try to hype everybody up like, hey, let's do it. 5 and 4, right? 5 and 4. And 4, of course, for their services, they received slightly better pay and slightly better privileges than most of the other workers. And it is argued by a lot of historians that the 5-year plan, although it might have been inefficient, did in effect crash industrialize the Soviet Union. Iron output, as well as the production of things like tractors and airplanes, doubled over the course of these 4 years and effectively created an industrial working class overnight. One really interesting fact that I like to point out is that while Lenin, as leader of the Soviet Union, had argued that all workers should get equal pay, Stalin did not necessarily agree with that. And during the 5-year plan, workers who had more specialty skills got paid differently than workers who did not have specialty skills. So in the name of industrializing the Soviet Union, Soviet leadership were willing to go a little bit counter to standard communist doctrine. From a global perspective, this rapid industrialization of a country at the beginning of World War I was not totally industrialized, looked very impressive to the rest of the world because this was during the Great Depression, when industrial production was dropping in most of the world. People were unemployed in most of the world. This new communist state, the first of its kind, seems to be thriving while everybody else is suffering. That looked pretty good to the rest of the world. And Soviet planners were not afraid to play that up a little bit in propaganda. But a number of nations in the 20th century would also adopt 5-year plans as a result of the Soviet success. Both during the 5-year plan and after it, Soviet leadership realized, however, that creating a new industrial working class overnight was leading to some food problems. You might remember chapter 29 in the Industrial Revolution. The only way you get a working class is you need to have an excess amount of food to support said working class. And unfortunately for the Soviet Union, food production had not surpassed its 1914 levels. Admittedly, going through a massive civil war doesn't help with that kind of thing. But there were a number of private farmers who had been allowed to create plots of land under the new economic policy, and these farmers created a surplus of food, which they then sold on the open market to their own profit. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but historically speaking, when farmers own their own land, they tend to produce more and produce a profit. And so while the Soviet Union's official motto, official justification for the collectivization policy, that is, bringing all the farms under state control, was to create more food, the reality was they actually wanted to control that food surplus and direct it where it needed to go. And to this end, they created large farms called kolkhoz, large government farms that a lot of peasants actually did willingly join, where they would bring their land together, or the thought at least was that if you pooled your labor together, you could ideally produce more food. And that is probably true if these farms were well stocked and well equipped. Many of them were not, though. And there were a number of peasants who resisted, that did not want to give up their private land or their effective surplus. The government took the time to target these individuals in a mass campaign known as dekulakization, in which they targeted the wealthy peasants they collectively called kulaks, although there was no set definition on exactly what a kulak was. It was effectively an enemy of the people. And so this resulted in the arrest, murder, and deportation of anybody deemed to be a kulak. But again, it was a pretty vague term. So if you had a peasant who had just done okay under the NEP, and didn't want to join the collective farm, he would be considered a kulak and his land could be seized. And Soviet propaganda did an excellent job of whipping up the masses to target the kulaks. So for example, you see a Soviet propaganda poster here about resisting the influence of kulaks. And the collectivization, which began in the late 20s, by the 1930s had collectivized about 50% of all farmland. So all farmland in the Soviet Union, about half of it was part of a large state-run collective farm. Despite that, output actually declined, in part because many of these farms were under-equipped and poorly staffed, but also because of a combination of low rainfall, a drought, unrealistic target quotas. The government projected that they were going to grow more grain than they actually did, and then they took some of the grain that was grown and traded it for foreign credit with Germany, as well as resistance from peasants who decided to simply kill their animals instead of handing them over to the Soviet government, which, by the way, the cow population of the Soviet Union didn't recover until the 1950s, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly here. The unfortunate result of all this was what is known as the Soviet famines of 1932 to 1934. And while this did affect the entire Soviet Union, even people in the cities had to start using ration cards, it struck the territory that would become the Ukraine and Kazakhstan particularly hard. In Ukraine alone, somewhere between 5 to 10 million deaths, an event that has become known in Ukrainian history as Holodomor, or the starving times, where peasants were literally forbidden and stopped at gunpoint from leaving the countryside where there was no food, has led a number of both Ukrainian nationalists and historians to speculate that it might have in fact been a targeted famine designed to depopulate a troublesome Soviet republic. Kazakhstan had it even worse, though. You might remember that the people of Kazakhstan were steppe nomads, and part of Soviet policy had been to forcibly settle them onto farms. However, most of them did not even know how to farm, as they've been nomads for all of their lives. And so as a result of this famine in Kazakhstan, somewhere like 45% of the population of the territory that is now Kazakhstan either died or fled the region to another territory. And the thing to understand about these famines is that they demonstrate the drastic consequences that can happen when state power is either used maliciously or used ignorantly. One of the themes of the 20th century. The level of privatization to collectivization would fluctuate throughout Soviet history. By the mid-1930s, the government of the Soviet Union had effective control over the countryside. And so for Stalin, fresh off the success of the 5-year plan, now it was time to solidify his hold and eliminate his rivals from the Politburo, that is the governing body of the Soviet Union. And he does this through a campaign of what is called the Terror. And through a number of trials, which are called the Moscow trials, the original Bolshevik leadership who had led the revolution was eliminated. Ethnic leaders from Central Asia were also eliminated. Most of these individuals were accused of trumped up charges and coerced into confessing via torture or imprisonment, and a number of them were in fact executed. Stalin helped enforce these rules through a secret police known as the Cheka, and a number of individuals who were not executed were sent off to the Gulag system, which is a series of about 475 known, that we know of, prison camps across the Soviet Union between 1930 and 1950. At any one given time, about 5% of the Soviet population was in a gulag, which may not seem like a lot, but that's really high. In the decades between 1930 and 1950, about 1.7 million people died. Now, these were ostensibly prisons, but they also served in economic purposes. Historians who look at the Soviet Union have pointed out that most of these gulags were placed in remote areas that were underdeveloped, and wherever a gulag was placed, a city tended to spring up around it, followed by a railroad, followed by perhaps some sort of extractive industry, such as logging or gold mining or oil drilling. And so there is the case to be made that gulags, while they were a prison system, also served as a form of forced labor to help grow the new Soviet economy. Though to say it is just a form of forced labor would be an oversimplification. The terror also included an element of repression of public displays of religion. Now, this had actually been going on since the very inception of the Soviet Union, as communism practiced in the Soviet Union was an atheist ideology. And so this took a number of forms. So, for example, the government of the Soviet Union sponsored the League of Militant Atheists, which were groups that went around and try to convince people to leave their religion and put up anti-religious propaganda and closed houses of worship, and in some cases even demolished houses of worship. And this was not limited to the Russian Republic and the Christian churches. In Central Asia, they also targeted Muslim institutions of learning. And interestingly enough, something called the anti-veiling campaign, in which they encouraged Central Asian women to remove their veils and join modern society. All this is to say that the new Soviet Union, and especially under Stalin, took control of its society greater than any state had ever done in history up to this point. Between state-directed industrialization, the political terror, and the collectivization of agriculture, whether the outcome was negative or positive, one cannot deny that the total control of society was a very new feature in history. That the power of the 20th century state was in some ways a distinct break from the past. Let us shift and talk about the United States and Germany. So you might remember from chapter 29, I talked a little bit about social democracy, which is a philosophy within a capitalist liberal democracy where the government undertakes economic and social interventions to promote social justice in society. Now, in Europe, the country that probably had the strongest social democratic position would be Germany, where in the German Empire, the socialists were the opposition party. They opposed the monarchy. And after the 1918 revolution, they were, for the most part, the ruling coalition within the new Weimar Republic. And although they didn't push to undertake a revolution, they undertook such social improvements as the expansion of voting rights, including giving women the right to vote, massive public housing projects, many for veterans of World War I or those who had been injured in World War I, as well as maternity leave for pregnant women, along with improving the existing social safety net and pension system. And while this all won them a lot of good favor with the public, they were in the unfortunate position of ruling a defeated country that had just undergone a revolution and was forced to pay very large reparations in the middle of a Great Depression. And so their inability to bring some sort of economic stability to German life outside of a few years in the 1920s meant that they were always in danger of being replaced by a more radical party that the population perceived could fix those problems. Social democracy in the United States has a very interesting turn. There's never been an election of a candidate who officially describes describes themselves as a social democrat to the office of the presidency, although we've had a few local politicians around the nation. Probably the closest the United States has ever had to a social democrat as a leader would be Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected president in 1932 and is the only president to serve 4 terms. Fun fact. Now, he was elected in the depths of the Great Depression when the unemployment rate was up somewhere in the 20%. And he sought to take action, alleviate some of the suffering, and to try to kickstart the economy again with a series of programs he calls the New Deal. And these were a combination of targeted relief and targeted works programs, which include things like the National Labor Relations Act, which allowed unions to form for the first time in history, as well as the Social Security Act, which guaranteed an old age pension to people, if I'm remembering correctly, over the age of 56, and then it's been adjusted since then. Both of these were designed to try to kickstart the economy. The National Labor Relations Act was designed to prevent industrial strife between labor unions and corporations, and the Social Security Act was designed to take elderly people out of the workforce by giving them a guaranteed income and to make room for younger workers. FDR was also really good at managing the press. For example, he had a series of what he called fireside chats, where he used the radio to make direct connections with the American people. At this time, many American households did at least have a radio. And these fireside chats, these one-on-ones that Roosevelt would have with you in your home at the end of the day while you're sitting by the fire, really helped to increase his popularity and sell the American people on his ideas. And this all sort of accumulated in 1944 with his Economic Bill of Rights, in which Roosevelt argued that all Americans should have access to things like a job that pays above poverty wages, a good education, and the right to housing, which all sound pretty radical in the 21st century United States. However, FDR himself would pass away before he was able to implement any of that. And gradually, although many of his programs did remain in place and do remain in place to this day, no president since Franklin Roosevelt has ever had quite the social democrat element or quite the level of economic populism that FDR had. I should probably also note that a lot of historians are very careful to point out that the New Deal does not actually end the Great Depression. The Great Depression is ended by the worldwide economic kickstart of World War II and the resumption of international trade that accompanies it. And so while social democracy may not be like a direct challenge to the liberal order, it is nonetheless somewhat of an alternate way of thinking about simply having free markets and free trade. The idea of social rights in addition to your political rights. So not just the right to vote, but also the right to earn a living, not just the right to freedom of speech, but also the right to adequate housing. These ideas are going to be much more developed in other parts of the world at the same time, but we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 35. Let's talk a little bit about fascism. Now, fascism is a word that is very broad. It has a lot of elements to it. So I'm going to do my best to sort of define it here, but understand the definition I give is going to necessarily be a summary and somewhat incomplete. But let's first talk about why fascism arises in the 1920s. And there's a number of contingencies that come together that make the 1920s the beginning of fascism in Europe. One would be the shock of the Russian Revolution, the proletariat revolution that had thrown Russia into chaos. It was scaring a lot of people. The other would be the continued disillusionment from World War I. Even the countries that had been victorious oftentimes didn't get everything they wanted. And so there was a lot of resentment and anger, especially from veterans who perceived the sacrifice of their comrades as having been for nothing, as well as social change across Europe, specifically increased visibility of women and the decline in respect for traditional authority, especially in Germany, but in many other parts of Europe as well. So the word fascism comes from the Italian fascio, which refers to a bundle of sticks. The idea being that a single stick could break, but a group of sticks, a bundle of sticks, cannot be broken. And this is what fascism aspires to do, is unite the entire nation, every class and group, under the banner of the state, hence the bundle of sticks. They represent every element of the nation. And this is why fascism in general is anti-democratic, because it believes that democracies pit special interest groups against one another. And it's also anti-communist. It rejects the notion of class conflict, an integral part of communist ideology. Other features of fascism include hypernationalism, that is either returning to a glorious past or promoting a glorious future for the people of the nation. Militarism, and that is the buildup of military forces and the militarization of society, that is organizing society along militaristic lines. Xenophobia, that is an external enemy to fear or to rally against. And this usually goes hand in hand with anti-communism, as well as a strong emphasis on traditional gender and social roles. This is kind of the idea of a mythical past. This kind of goes hand in hand with that hyper-nationalism, right? A restoring of the correct order of things. And because these features, and these are just some of many features of fascism, are fairly flexible and they're not rooted to one area, throughout the 1920s and 30s, there were fascist parties all across the world, including places like Mexico, Lebanon, Yugoslavia, and even the United States. There was a group called the German-American Bund, or the German-American Alliance, that operated for the 5 years that led up to World War II. And they even held in 1939 this massive rally in Madison Square Garden in New York, which recently in 2018 got a documentary made about it. It's called A Night at the Garden, which shows this massive American Fascist Party rally. And it's trippy because you have these giant posters of George Washington next to swastikas. And it just really shows the flexibility of fascism. It can go anywhere and have an appeal in any society it puts its roots down. Sinclair Lewis, who wrote the book It Can't Happen Here, famously said that when fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the flag and carrying the cross. Now, what states are considered to be fascist? Well, there are 3 states that almost all historians agree were fascist. That would be Nazi Germany, Italy under Benito Mussolini, and Spain under Francisco Franco. After these 3, it tends to get a little contentious, like, what exactly is a fascist state after these 3? Do the corporatist governments of Latin America count? I mean, was Juan Perón of Argentina a fascist? What about Japan before World War II? I mean, they were still a monarchy. The military ran society, but does that make them fascist? Let's talk a little bit about Italy, which is where fascism is usually acknowledged to have originated from. So Italy, despite being one of the victors in World War I, was not satisfied with the territory it was supposed to get. Britain and France had essentially lied to Italy and not given it everything they promised they would. In fact, a number of Italian veterans were so upset that they occupied the Adriatic port of Fiume, which is now part of Croatia, but had been promised to Italy. And so they went and took the territory from the new state of Yugoslavia and occupied it for a year until the Italian Navy showed up and chased them out. This, combined with a series of labor strikes across northern Italy in the early 1920s, partially inspired by the communist revolution in Russia. And the atmosphere in Italy was very tense. And it was in this tense atmosphere that an army veteran and a former socialist himself, named Benito Mussolini, formed a veterans league that would later become known as the Black Shirts, advocated a new ideology, that of unification under the state. And him and his group, the Black Shirts, they would beat up socialists, they would beat up labor leaders. This made them very popular because they would beat up these people who were perceived to be a great threat to society. So rapid was their rise in popularity and their membership that Benito Mussolini ordered his followers to march on Rome. And you had about 10,000 of his Black Shirts marched to Rome. And even though the Italian military told the King of Italy, hey, look, we can chase these guys off. Don't worry about it. The King of Italy was so nervous that he kind of gave in and said, okay, I'll make Benito Mussolini like chancellor, or I'll give him a position of authority. Shortly after that, Benito Mussolini took that position of authority and one step further and declared himself Il Duce. He didn't replace the king, but nonetheless, he was now the power behind the throne. And as part of his new state ideology of unification under the state, he promised to build a new Roman Empire, by which he meant he was going to conquer territory in the Mediterranean. And he began by ordering the pacification of Italy's colony in Libya. Now, Libya had been an Italian colony since 1911. However, the Amazigh people that lived in the interior in the Sahara Desert oftentimes resisted Italian authority. And so Mussolini sent generals who waged a near genocidal campaign against the indigenous peoples in the name of controlling the territory. And domestically, Benito Mussolini put his ideas into practice, an idea of an all-controlling, all-consuming state with a total centralization of power and his own building of a cult of personality. I should note that Joseph Stalin also had a cult of personality about him. Benito Mussolini was everywhere. He was in schoolhouses. His poster was displayed in public. He was on the front of every newspaper. He built up a group of loyal followers. His Black Shirts became some of his most fanatical defenders. To keep control, he limited the freedom of the press, and he also limited civil rights that had been guaranteed prior to his rise. He also used the radio to broadcast propaganda and maintain support for he would also tour the country giving these really fiery speeches and get people all riled up. In a sort of interesting addendum to this, Mussolini's crackdown on civil rights targeted the Sicilian mafia in southern Italy, and it's at this time that many mafiosos flee to the United States to get away from Mussolini. Also, that this mafia would assist the United States in invading Italy during World War II. The fascist government in Italy also practiced something known as corporatism, a method of running the economy that includes the unions, labor unions, the state, and the businesses manage the economy collectively. The idea is very suitable to fascism, which believes in bringing all members of society together. So in this case, all the people involved, the state, the business, and the labor unions come together and run the economy. Now, in reality, in most fascist countries, the labor unions are completely under the control of the state. So it really is just sort of the state and the businesses running the economy. Usually these labor unions are not allowed to strike, and the government doesn't do much to interfere and better their situation. But a great example of this would be the National Council of Corporations, which Mussolini formed in 1930 to guide economic production. While Benito Mussolini might have been the first fascist, he's certainly not the most popular one. That title probably goes to Nazi Germany. It's much more well known. So as I mentioned earlier, the Weimar Republic, which was the democracy that succeeded the German Empire after World War I, was very unstable. On top of the Great Depression and the reparations payment they were required to make for losing World War I, which came out to about $31.4 billion, which is a lot of money back then, there was a lot of anger and conspiracy over the Treaty of Versailles. Former veterans, former generals would go around and talk about how they actually didn't lose the war, but the government had betrayed them. And so there was this great sense of shame and anger at the Treaty of Versailles that motivated a lot of people to seek a strong leader that could make effective change, and not these social democrats who had probably betrayed the country anyway, in their eyes. And so it's in this atmosphere that an army veteran by the name of Adolf Hitler, working undercover for the Bavarian police, infiltrates a small workers' party called the Nazi Party in 1921, and he rapidly rises to power. That's right, Hitler didn't actually found the Nazi Party, he joined the Nazi Party, but he rapidly rose to power and became one of its key leaders. Now, much like Mussolini, the Nazis had their own militia groups that would fight with socialists and labor leaders on the streets. These were called the Brown Shirts, or the SA, and the Schutzstaffel, or the SS, who wore black to differentiate themselves from the brown shirts. In 1923, inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, Hitler and a group of his followers attempt to overthrow the government of Bavaria in a beer hall putsch, putsch being the German word for coup. Now, if you're going to overthrow a government, a place where people are drinking alcohol is probably not the best place to do it. And it did fail, and Hitler and his followers got into a shootout with police that almost ended in Hitler's death, but he survived. And while serving time in prison for treason, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, in which he essentially laid out his particular fascist ideology. And among many things that he discussed, probably one of the more central ones to understanding how World War II is going to play out, the belief that the German people don't have enough living space, or Lebensraum. So what did Hitler mean by Lebensraum? Well, he meant living space. He argued essentially that Germany's population was too big for Germany itself. Fun fact, the population density in Germany today is I think somewhere like 1.5 times higher than it was when Hitler wrote this, and basically argued that the German people were going to go extinct if they didn't conquer land in order to support their growing population. And in particular, he was looking east to the Soviet Union, which also blended nicely with his hatred of communism. Now, the Nazi Party remained active in politics throughout the 20s and the 30s, but it could never win a majority of the vote. At its peak during the disputed 1932 election, they only got 35% of the vote. However, because there were 6 other candidates, no one party got a full plurality. And so it was in this disputed election, conservatives, business magnates, and Nazis put pressure on the then very old former general and president of the Republic, Paul von Hindenburg, to appoint Hitler chancellor. One of the most interesting things about this is that all the people who put pressure on Hindenburg to appoint Hitler chancellor did so under the assumption they could control Hitler, and that he was not going to be as bad as the communist or socialist candidates who were also in this disputed election. However, that could not have been further from what happened. The Nazis almost immediately set to work centralizing their authority. They did not have to wait long for an opportunity to take full control. In late 1932, the German parliament building called the Reichstag caught on fire. How did this happen is still debated by historians. There was a Dutch communist who just happened to be there and who was arrested and interrogated and put on trial and found guilty and quickly executed. But there is a lot of suspicion that this person probably didn't actually do it, and that the Nazis may have had some sort of hand in lighting the Reichstag on fire, although there's no hard proof of that. The Nazi Party took this opportunity to push for the enacting of the Enabling Acts, part of the Constitution of the Weimar Republic that gave effectively unlimited authority to the Chancellor and the President. The equivalent of the German Parliament approved the Enabling Acts, although not unanimously, and I might add, with armed Nazis in the room while they were voting. Those who voted no to the Enabling Acts would quickly find themselves in prison or dead. The Enabling Acts gave the Nazis total power, and they promptly put this to work. They banned all political parties except for the Nazi Party. They strictly monitored church groups, civic groups, sports groups, and the secret police, known as the Gestapo, kept tabs on all potential enemies. And they renewed conscription to build up the German army. Now, the conscription had been explicitly banned by the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I. And we'll talk more about this later in chapter 36, but effectively, one of the first things the Nazis did was repudiate the Treaty of Versailles and say, we're just not going to follow this anymore. It also gave the Nazis the chance to put into effect their racialized view of society, which included a eugenics program to sterilize undesirable women and to euthanize the mentally feeble. Now, we might think today about euthanizing someone with a mental disability as pretty darn horrifying. And it quite frankly is. However, the Nazis were not shy about this. And you can look up, there are dozens of Nazi posters where they explicitly calculate how much a mentally feeble person costs the taxpayer every single year as a justification for their removal from society. This poster I have up here in the corner of the screen is very interesting because it makes the case that the German government is not the only one out there sterilizing undesirable women, and it shows the flags of a number of countries that also have this practice, including the United States, where some states, including California, had laws on the books as late as the 1960s that allowed for the sterilization of female prisoners. So, while it's always important to remember that the Nazis were horrible people, many of their ideas did not come out of thin air, and to overly demonize them would be to ignore that their ideas had a long history, in particular scientific racism and anti-Semitism. The Nazis took this to another level with something called the Nuremberg Laws. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws stripped Jewish individuals of their citizenship, forbid them from holding certain positions. So if you were a Jewish professor, you were fired. If you were a Jewish banker, you might lose your job. If you were a Jewish policeman, you might get fired. This is actually the only time when the aging president Paul von Hindenburg stopped Hitler from doing something, which was he stopped Hitler from removing the pensions of Jewish army veterans. He, being a military man himself, argued that this was unconscionable. Just something to think about. We will get to the Holocaust, but what's important to understand is that the Holocaust did not happen overnight. Large-scale mass violence against any group doesn't happen overnight. There could be spontaneous outbursts, yes, but something as organized and extensive as the Holocaust takes time and organization. It also takes othering, that is, removing the individuals who are to be targeted for violence from mainstream society or making them seem different. And this is what begins to happen after the Nazis take power, first with the Nuremberg Laws and then with Kristallnacht, which was a single night of mass violence against Jews across Germany. The Nazi Party sought to effectively remove Jews as part of their society in the eyes of the common German person. So I almost considered not including this slide, but lately the internet seems to be awash in very poorly researched notions about what Nazism was. So if you were to Google the Nazi Party, you would realize that it's an acronym for National Socialist German Workers' Party. And that sounds pretty communist to me. If you are on the internet, you'll probably see people arguing just that in fact, Nazis were not fascists, they were communists or they were socialists. I mean, after all, look, it's in their name. And there is a kernel of truth to this. In the initial formation of the Nazi Party, there was an element of economic populism. That is, using the power of the state to direct economic activity for the benefit of the people. This particular strain of Nazi thought is called Socialism, named after the Nazi Glegostrasse, who advocated this policy. In particular, he would often rail against what he called Jewish capitalism. And this idea of Jews secretly controlling the world's financial system goes back a very long way. The Nazi Party platform of 1925 does list, among its 25 points, things that do sound pretty socialist, including housing for the German people and a percentage of industry profits to be redistributed amongst the people. However, upon taking power, Hitler and his fellow Nazis proceeded then to kill all of the left-ish leaning socialist individuals within the party. That's what the Night of the Long Knives was all about. It was the murder of all of the left-wing elements within the Nazi Party and their effective removal from any sort of place of influence, including Glegostrasse. And this is what I think a lot of people who only look at the surface level miss about what fascism is and what socialism and communism is. Fascist governments do use industry and agriculture to increase the power of the state, and they do take some of those gains and redistribute them to the people. However, they do not collectivize or nationalize everything. Private property remains. It may be regulated, but it remains nonetheless. And these benefits are often restricted based on nationality or religious group or racial group. Jews would not have benefited from National Socialism because, according to the Nazi Party, they weren't citizens. Traditional socialism makes no distinction in these categories. So I want to quick look at two examples that are sometimes brought up as proof that the Nazis were actually communists. One would be the Farm Law of 1933, Reichshofgesetz. And basically it said peasants were not allowed to sell their farmland. And while that is definitely a big government intrusion in the lives of peasants, that's not redistribution of land. If anything, that's a reinforcement of the principle of private property. Another example would be the Deutsche Arbeitsbund, which was the German government-sponsored labor union from 1933, which combined all existing labor unions into one single labor union that would negotiate with any given corporation within Germany. Also, they got May 1st off. And while this is also sometimes brought up as an example of the government serving at the behest of the workers, it was more of a way for the government to prevent strikes from happening. In short, While fascist governments do practice a sort of corporatism, as I talked about with Benito Mussolini, this is not widespread nationalization, and this is not widespread redistribution of wealth. It is true that the German government did put quotas and direct industry to produce certain goods, especially the steel and war-related industries in the years that led up to World War II and during World War II. However, those businesses got to keep most of their profits, and they got free labor in the form of concentration camp victims and Soviet POWs. So it would be incorrect to say that the Nazi government confiscated and redistributed the businesses in Germany. Let's wrap this up by talking a little bit about society under both fascism and communism. So under communism, society was a little bit different than it had been before communism. In particular, there was this idea that communism, being a wholly untested ideology at the time, would lead to the creation of the new Soviet man and woman. And society did seem to be pushing in that direction. So, for example, urbanization in the Soviet Union skyrocketed from only 18% when the Soviet Union was created to 40% by the end of World War II to 56% by the end of the Soviet Union's history at the end of the century. In these big new cities, there were what are known as palaces of culture, which were places that workers could go after work and watch a play or learn about history or watch a movie. In fact, there was an entire Soviet government department dedicated to making films, admittedly propaganda films, but they could be entertaining nonetheless. Combine this with guaranteed education that saw literacy rates skyrocket, and it really did seem like a new society and a new individual was at hand. One of the key features of these brand new cities in Soviet society would be large concrete housing blocks that people often think about in a negative sense. They think about as a former Soviet country. And while they may have been quite ugly to look at, they were nonetheless a functioning house with running water and active heat, something that was guaranteed in the Soviet constitution, yes, which was a step up from a lot of the villages that people had been living in before then. And housing was a right guaranteed by the Soviet constitution. That was a pretty big step. Women were also given many new opportunities in both education and local politics. Of course, women had been working in factories during World War I, but now women were not only allowed to, but encouraged to go into local politics and go to school and get a higher education. That said, though, many scholars have pointed out that women were still expected to do traditional gender-related tasks. This is sometimes referred to as the double shift. This, despite the fact that the Soviet government had like super duper promised they would provide daycare and childcare. Speaking of this, there was actually a DBQ about women in the Communist Party. There was a practice DBQ from a few years back. Despite its failings and the fact that it hid the starvation in the countryside, the image of the USSR abroad was broadly popular amongst activists, artists, and the young. So, for example, the African-American activist Louise Thomas Patterson, who was the first African-American woman to get a PhD in the United States, visited the USSR in 1933. And while it's true she was only shown what the Soviet government wanted her to see, she nonetheless saw it as a positive experience. She said, quote, "This was a thrilling experience for all of us to see new nations arising out of centuries of illiteracy, poverty, ending even nomad life." And that's the thing about the Soviet Union in the years before World War II, is it genuinely represented in many ways a brave new world that had not been tested before. And to people all over the globe who were dissatisfied with the existing system, the Soviet Union became something to look to. And we'll talk more about that in chapter 35. In Nazi Germany, society was centered around the idea of national glory and an emphasis on tradition. So, for example, in response to the Great Depression, the Nazis began to rearm the German military, which put people back to work, but they also began large public works projects. This is somewhat similar to what FDR was doing in the United States, although I don't want to draw a comparison between FDR and the Nazis. So, for example, the gigantic Olympiastadion, which can be still seen in Berlin today, was constructed for the 1936 Olympics, which Berlin was hosting. It is a massive stadium. Its sheer size, large stone columns and archways, was meant to be a display of Nazi superiority. This, along with the German athletes who were expected to win all the gold medals at the competition. Many Americans know the famous story of Jesse Owens, who beat the German sprinter and took home 4 gold medals, allegedly was snubbed by Adolf Hitler. According to one United States newspaper, Jesse Owens had single-handedly dismantled the myth of the superior German man. That might have been true, but Hitler actually didn't snub Jesse Owens. Hitler didn't greet any of the athletes. Hitler would later mail Jesse Owens an autographed photo of himself. Whereas Jesse Owens, when he got back to the United States, had to go to his own banquet through the service elevator of a New York hotel because it was a segregated hotel. Later in life, he himself would say, "Hitler didn't snub me. The United States president snubbed me. He didn't even send me a congratulation telegram." In addition to the glory of the state being emphasized through large building projects, traditional values, especially as it were related to women and gender roles, was encouraged by the state. So, for example, mothers were given medals for the number of children they had, and they were discouraged from taking jobs in the workforce. And so, for the most part, while women under the Nazi women under the Nazi regime were relegated to their traditional roles. There is one noted exception to this, and that's something known as the Rosenstrasse protest in 1943, which was the only known mass protest against the Nazis. And it was a number of German women whose husbands had been arrested by the police and were going to be shipped off to concentration camps. 1,700 women stood outside the police office for 3 days in the snow and the rain, demanding that their husbands be released. And in the end, the Nazi police backed down and let them go. And last but not least, I'd like to talk a little bit about something called degenerate art. So both communism and fascism did use propaganda, but fascism also removed what it called degenerate art. This was art by Germans and other individuals, which they considered to be detrimental to society. This is art that was harmful to society just by looking at it. And in particular, this declaration of art to be degenerate and to be removed strikes a chord with me because one of my ancestors, whose name is Emilio Nolde, who's a North German impressionist, was one of the most removed artists during this whole degenerate art campaign. For example, his woodcut down here called The Prophet was declared degenerate. And this piece, along with I think about 1,000 other pieces of his work, were removed from museums across Germany. And he was ordered to stop making art by the government, even though ostensibly he actually did support the Nazi government. You might remember that governments have long tried to use art as a way to reinforce their legitimacy. The Nazi government also practiced the role of removing art, which it perceived as threatening, which has also been seen throughout history. The Nazis were just one group to do it the other way as well, not only promoting their own art, but actively removing art that they saw as a threat to their legitimacy or somehow dangerous to society. So we'll sort of wrap things up here with this table. And if you'd like to pause the video and take a closer look, this table sort of illustrates the major differences between communism and fascism. If you're still sort of confused, you can check out this table here. But I want to thank you for joining me. You should definitely be able to answer those first 2 questions in the beginning of the presentation. My name is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.